It looks like betrayal always ends with the same picture. One person walking away feeling powerful, while the other is left in silence. But what most people never realize is that this is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning of a much deeper psychological chain reaction that slowly turns against the one who believed they had control. There is a hidden pattern in narcissistic behavior that rarely gets spoken about in a clear way, because on the surface everything looks clean, confident, and even victorious for them. Yet behind that surface, there is a slow breakdown that starts the moment they cross certain emotional boundaries with the wrong person. This video will take you through that hidden reality step by step, showing how betrayal does not just destroy trust on one side, but how it begins a silent collapse on the other side as well, where the need for control, validation, and emotional superiority starts to backfire in ways most people never connect at first. The goal here is to uncover what really happens after the mask falls off, how narcissistic patterns create short-term wins but long-term emotional damage, and why the very act of betrayal often becomes the starting point of their own psychological downfall, without them even noticing it in real time. As this story unfolds, attention will be given to the mindset behind these actions, the emotional blind spots that lead to repeated destruction of relationships, and the hidden consequences that build up quietly until they can no longer be ignored, not by the people around them, and not even by themselves. There is a deeper truth here that often gets missed, that every action driven by ego and emotional control carries a cost that does not disappear. It only delays its return. And when it comes back, it does so in patterns that affect trust, stability, and emotional balance in ways that feel confusing, but are actually very predictable from a psychological point of view. This is not about instant revenge or dramatic outcomes, but about understanding the slow unfolding of consequences that follow choices made from manipulation, pride, and emotional detachment. As this video continues, each layer will connect the visible confidence of narcissistic behavior with the invisible cracks that form underneath it, revealing why certain people keep repeating the same cycles of loss even when they believe they are always in control. By the end of this breakdown, a much clearer picture will form about how emotional power shifts over time, how betrayal reshapes both sides in different ways, and why the one who seems unaffected at first is often the one who eventually faces the deepest internal consequences. Stay until the end, because the final part brings everything together in a way that changes how these situations are understood, especially when it comes to the long-term effects that are rarely discussed openly. If this perspective adds clarity to your understanding, then welcome to the channel, and consider subscribing for more psychology-based breakdowns that reveal the hidden side of human behavior in a simple and honest way. The moment trust is placed in someone who later turns out to be driven by narcissistic behavior, the emotional shift feels almost unreal, because everything once felt stable, meaningful, and safe. Yet suddenly it becomes confusing, cold, and deeply unsettling in a way that is hard to explain to others. There is a specific kind of pain that forms when loyalty is given fully, when intentions are honest, when emotional effort is real, and yet the response received is detachment, replacement, or manipulation that feels completely one-sided. It creates a feeling of being used as a temporary source of attention, rather than a real human connection. And that realization does not come instantly, but builds slowly through small moment inconsistency, emotional withdrawal, and subtle disrespect that only makes sense later when everything is already broken. In that process, there is often a stage where confusion dominates more than sadness, because the mind keeps trying to understand what changed, what went wrong, and why someone who once showed care could suddenly act as if the entire connection meant nothing at all. During this emotional phase, the most painful part is not just losing the relationship, but realizing that the effort, loyalty, and emotional investment were not matched in the same way. And instead of mutual respect, there was a hidden imbalance that was never acknowledged openly. The feeling of being replaced or discarded often arrives in silence, through observation rather than explanation. When actions begin to show that someone else has taken the place that once felt secure, and that shift creates a deep internal shock that stays longer than the event itself. In many cases, what makes this experience even more confusing is the way narcissistic individuals appear after the separation or betrayal takes place. Because on the surface there is often a display of confidence, freedom, and emotional control that seems like they have moved forward without any impact. They may appear happier, more active, more socially engaged, or even more successful. And this outward behavior creates an illusion that they have gained something valuable from the situation, as if the loss of connection did not affect them at all. This appearance can feel deeply unfair to the one who was left behind, because it gives the impression that the effort, loyalty, and emotional depth meant nothing, while the other person continues life without visible struggle. However, what is not visible in that external image is the internal instability that often begins to develop quietly underneath that surface. The confidence that is displayed outwardly is often not rooted in emotional balance, temporary validation, shifting attention, and the constant need to maintain an image of control. That is why the so-called win, that seems obvious from the outside, does not remain stable over time, because it depends on continuous reinforcement from new sources rather than a stable internal foundation. Over time, cracks begin to form in that structure, not immediately but gradually, as the same patterns repeat, and the emotional emptiness that was avoided earlier begins to resurface in different forms. What looks like progress from a distance is often just movement without emotional grounding, and that creates a cycle where nothing truly settles, even when everything appears to be moving forward. The deeper psychological layer behind narcissistic behavior is often connected to an internal need for control, validation, and reinforcement of self-importance, where emotional connections are not always experienced in the same way as they are by someone who forms deeper attachment. Instead of seeing relationships as mutual emotional exchanges, there can be a tendency to view them as sources of validation that confirm identity, worth, or superiority. And once that source feels threatened, or no longer provides the desired response, detachment or replacement can happen without the emotional processing that most people would expect. This is why betrayal becomes easier in certain patterns, because the focus is not always on long-term emotional consequences but on immediate emotional gain, such as attention, admiration, or a sense of control in the moment. In that mindset, long-term impact is often underestimated or not fully considered, because the priority is centered around maintaining emotional stability through external validation rather than internal reflection. When emotional consequences are not fully processed in advance, actions can feel justified at the moment they are taken, even if those same actions create deeper problems later. There is often a belief, sometimes conscious and sometimes unconscious, that consequences can be avoided, controlled, or simply outpaced by moving forward quickly into new situations, new connections, or new environments. This creates a cycle where emotional responsibility is delayed rather than addressed. And each repeated pattern adds another layer of unresolved tension beneath the surface. Over time, this can lead to a disconnect between external behavior and internal emotional reality, where things appear controlled and successful on the outside, but remain unstable in ways that are not immediately visible, continuing to build quietly in the background without clear recognition until the same emotional patterns begin to repeat again in different forms. There comes a point in these behavioral patterns where the momentum begins to shift in a way that is not immediately obvious, because everything still appears functional on the surface. Yet the foundation that once supported that sense of control slowly starts to weaken through repeated experiences that no longer respond in the same predictable way. The early confidence that came from easily gaining attention or emotional reactions begins to face resistance as new interactions do not carry the same level of impact, and trust that was once freely given by others becomes more cautious, more limited, and in some cases completely withdrawn after previous patterns are recognized. This is where the reversal begins quietly, not as a dramatic event, but as a gradual change in how people respond, where initial impressions no longer last long enough to create the same emotional influence, and previous behaviors that once worked smoothly begin to lose effectiveness in new situations. Over time, this leads to a growing sense that connections are not forming with the same depth or stability as before, even though the surface-level interactions may still look active and socially engaged. What changes is the quality of those interactions, where emotional trust becomes harder to secure, and the same cycle of detachment and replacement starts to appear again, not because of a single event, but because of repeated patterns that begin to follow the individual from one situation to another. As this stage develops further, emotional emptiness often becomes more noticeable, not in an immediate or clearly defined way, but through subtle internal experiences that are difficult to acknowledge directly. There may be moments where attention is present but does not feel fulfilling, where social interaction exists but does not create lasting emotional satisfaction, and where external validation no longer carries the same weight it once did. This creates a quiet internal gap that is often filled temporarily through new attention or new connections. But the effect does not last, leading to a repeating cycle where the search for stimulation or validation continues without reaching a stable point. At the same time, patterns that were once easy to control begin to repeat in less predictable ways, where similar outcomes appear in different environments, creating a sense that despite changing circumstances, the underlying structure remains the same. Relationships begin to fail in quieter forms as well, not always through visible conflict, but through gradual disconnection, loss of emotional depth, and reduced trust, until the bond no longer feels sustainable even if no clear ending is declared. This silent breakdown becomes more common than dramatic separation, because the disconnection happens internally before it becomes visible externally. And by the time it is noticed, the emotional distance has already grown too large to easily repair. Behind this surface-level activity, a different reality develops that is not always visible from the outside, because the appearance of social engagement and confidence can continue even while internal stability becomes weaker over time. Instead of forming deep and lasting emotional bonds, interactions may begin to feel more temporary, where connections serve short-term emotional needs rather than long-term emotional grounding. This can lead to a pattern of repeated relational cycles where new attention is constantly sought to replace what no longer feels fulfilling, creating an ongoing need for external reinforcement that never fully settles into stability. Over time, this cycle contributes to emotional burnout, not necessarily in an immediate or dramatic sense, but through gradual exhaustion that builds from maintaining multiple shallow connections without experiencing deeper emotional resolution. As this continues, isolation can also begin to form in subtle ways. Not always physical isolation, but emotional separation from meaningful depth, where relationships exist but do not provide genuine grounding or security. In this state, even when surrounded by people, there can still be a persistent sense of internal distance, as if true emotional connection remains out of reach despite constant interaction. The need for validation does not disappear in this phase. Instead, it often increases, because the internal gap becomes more noticeable when external stimulation no longer fully satisfies it, leading to a continuous search for new sources of attention or approval that can temporarily fill that space, even though the effect fades quickly and the cycle repeats again without resolution. As the broader pattern becomes clearer, the understanding of betrayal itself begins to shift from a simple emotional event into a longer chain of consequences that extend beyond the immediate situation. What initially appears as a moment of gain or emotional advantage often reveals itself later as the starting point of repeated emotional imbalance, where the impact of actions continues to unfold long after the original event has passed. Betrayal in this context does not remain confined to the person who experienced it directly, because the patterns that lead to it also shape future outcomes for the one who initiated it, especially when those patterns are repeated across multiple situations without reflection or change. The consequences are not always immediate or visible in a dramatic form, but they accumulate through trust breakdowns, emotional instability, and repeated relational disruptions that gradually reshape how future connections form. Over time, what seemed like a moment of control or emotional superiority becomes part of a longer sequence of outcomes that affect emotional satisfaction and relational stability in ways that are often not recognized at the beginning. This shift in understanding moves the focus away from short-term emotional reactions and into a broader awareness of how actions influence long-term psychological patterns, where every decision connected to manipulation, detachment, or betrayal contributes to a larger structure of emotional cause and effect that continues to develop even when it is no longer being actively observed. As everything comes together, a quieter truth starts to stand out beneath all the confusion, the emotional weight, and the memories that felt unfinished. What once felt like loss slowly begins to look different when seen from a clearer perspective, because loyalty was never the weakness in this story. Loyalty was the proof of depth, sincerity, and emotional honesty, even in a situation where those qualities were not always returned in the same form. The pain that came from betrayal often creates the illusion of defeat in the beginning, but over time, understanding begins to shift, and what once felt like being replaced or discarded starts to reveal a deeper reality about patterns that were never stable to begin with. There is a certain relief in recognizing that not every ending is a reflection of personal worth, and not every departure is a sign of failure. In many cases, it is the result of choices, behaviors, and emotional limitations that were already shaping the outcome long before it became visible. With time, it becomes clearer that actions driven by ego, control, or emotional manipulation carry consequences that do not disappear, even if they are not seen immediately. Those consequences build quietly, shaping future experiences, influencing new connections, and affecting emotional stability in ways that often go unnoticed at first. What seemed like power in the moment gradually turns into repetition, and what looked like confidence slowly reveals its limits when it is not supported by real emotional depth. This is where the understanding changes, because the focus shifts away from the immediate pain and moves toward a more grounded awareness that every action carries weight, and every pattern eventually creates outcomes that reflect its true nature. The silence that followed betrayal was never emptiness. It was simply the space where clarity was forming, even if it was not visible in the beginning. There is no need to carry the belief that loyalty was misplaced or wasted, because genuine emotional intention always holds value, even when it is not recognized by the other person at the right time. What was given sincerely does not lose meaning simply because it was not received properly. Instead, it becomes part of a deeper understanding of human behavior, emotional imbalance, and the difference between temporary validation and real connection. Over time, the emotional intensity of the past loses its grip, and what remains is a clearer sense of awareness about how certain patterns unfold and why they repeat in the way they do. That clarity brings a different kind of strength, one that does not rely on revenge or validation, but on understanding and acceptance of how these dynamics actually work. At this point, everything settles into a more grounded realization that what leaves without appreciation often carries its own consequences forward, and what stays true in intention remains intact, regardless of how it was treated in the moment. The idea that someone gains by betraying a genuine connection becomes weaker when seen through the lens of time, because outcomes eventually reflect the emotional foundation behind actions. You did not lose by being loyal, and the path that followed was shaped more by their choices than by your worth. As this message closes, there is a space left for reflection, not bitterness, because understanding replaces confusion, and clarity replaces emotional noise. And now a simple question remains at the end of this journey. Have you ever seen someone regret losing a good person too late? If this video brought clarity to your thoughts, or helped you understand this situation in a deeper way, then make sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this truth today.